All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Ryan Romerman, and I am the Executive Director of the LGBTQ Institute at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Thank you for being here, and we appreciate your time today. I want to also note that we would not be here at all if it wasn't for Delta Airlines, who is serving as our founding sponsor of this annual event. So today, we're going to be talking a little bit about how corporations have been dealing with the recent events of COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and in particular, how corporations and their leaders have had to meet these challenging times, and they're reflecting the nation's values in more striking and bolder ways. So we're going to examine today issues of COVID-19, Black Lives Matter. We're going to be discussing LGBTQ discrimination and how those intersect. So to do that, I want to introduce to you our panelists. First, Pamela Stewart. Thank you, Pamela, for being here today. Senior Vice President of National Retail Sales for the Coca-Cola Company. Ranjan Goswami, Vice President of In-Flight Field Operations for Delta Airlines. And to Dr. Kamal Bob, Global Lead for Diversity Strategy and Research at Google, and the founding Senior Director of the Constellation Center for Equity and Computing at Georgia Tech. Now, I want to tee this conversation up by chatting a little bit about the Business Roundtable. You might have recalled that in 2019, the Business Roundtable, which is a group of CEOs of some of the largest companies, really decided to re-examine the corporate social construct from being just focused on shareholder success to looking at broader metrics such as communities, employees. And in particular, they talked about, in terms of their purpose of a corporation, one new aspect that I want to discuss, and that is investing in our employees. It was one of the key points. And they talked about how it starts with fair compensation and benefits, training and education to develop new skills, and fostering diversity, equity, inclusion. And my question to you all to start, and Pamela, I'll start with you. Prior to 2020, what had corporations been doing that you felt was pretty bold around DEI? And what shift, if any, have you seen in this past year around this work?
First off, thank you for having me here. I love this discourse, this wonderful, constructive discourse. As I think about what the corporations were doing, the bold things that corporations were doing at the time was really putting an eye towards talent by establishing diversity and inclusion officers, diversity, inclusion, and equity officers of the sort. Some corporations did that. Added to that, they started to talk about, particularly those that represented faces to the consumers, their marketing also had an angle of the imagery was more inclusive. I think we've had a sharp pivot since that time. That's table stakes. So having a diversity officer dedicated to fairness, inclusion, all of the things that you described is just to show up at the table. Now corporations, the business community, they're taking a leadership voice on changes in policy for fairness and human rights, advancements for, if you think about the social justice causes, they're the ones behind a lot of these hate crime bills getting passed. It's just the force of leadership and the corporate community has magnified, and quite frankly, the accountability that consumers now give corporations has intensified. So people are not just satisfied with consuming a brand, they have expectations that this brand would have a very clear voice, a clear segmented value structure, and that value structure is flowed through human rights activism, for lack of a better term, or more so advocacy, so that they can change the communities in which they operate. That is a sharp contrast from yesterday, even pre-March to now. And so it's been fascinating to watch.
You know, I would add, I think the quality of discourse that's happening within the communities of each of our companies is perhaps more meaningful and more real and authentic than we've ever seen, certainly in my career in the airline industry. And that, I think, is what's really the exciting part of this next step in our journey. And I think this really is a journey, right? We're seeing a lot more people feel free to talk about what they have been going through, being invited to do so, having safe spaces for that to happen. And those are where the ideas are ultimately, I think, coming from our people. So, you know, I would sort of characterize pre-2020, we were doing things and we were showing up, whether it was on marriage equality and filing briefs, which I believe all the companies represented here did in that effort. Having business resource groups that were on campus to, you know, have folks be able to talk with and network with one another. But this next level of dialogue that's happening across all dimensions of diversity, I think, is where the exciting magic is happening.
Well, I think I would agree with that basic framing. I think in the beginning, certainly relative to representational goals, those things, they were bold, yes, but I think a lot of it began in the corporate space under duress. There were a lot of lawsuits and extreme public pressure to make corporations be responsive to the representational issues or lack thereof. I do think that the bold steps now are relative to this policy landscape. I think the human rights, has been alluded to, is a singularly important part. But what I would also like to see happen, which I don't know that we've engaged in yet, is relative to the educational infrastructure. Here I'm a little bit biased because that's my interest, but I think the educational infrastructure of cities is a retardant to the larger growth goals that all of this DEI stuff began with in the first place. So we can't really achieve the long-term representational goals and all of the kind of the policy implications of having a representative workforce and a representative democracy without a functioning education system. And so in that sense, I think that one of the central bold moves going forward is in the policy space, but specifically corporations mandating and perhaps working a little bit more collaboratively and influentially on municipalities to fix this kind of broken public education system.
So to your point, Kamal, when you look at ways in which companies can do that, taking education as an example, what would be some of those steps to bring those stakeholders together to move that forward?
Well, I think if we begin from where we are, Atlanta is an interesting case in all of that. So we have, we're the bedrock of a huge amount of corporate infrastructure here. And in recent times, we've been courting a lot of tech companies and fintech companies, et cetera, to come here. And having been loosely involved in some of that, the basic proposition is that this is a good place to be. And so the story of Atlanta is, I don't need to say here, but the story of Atlanta is that it's kind of memorialized the civil rights legacies. We're the cities of hate. We're kind of one of the most progressive outposts in the southeastern United States, et cetera. But we also have, we're one of the most segregated cities in America. We have arguably the largest socioeconomic disparities of any major metropolitan city in the country with the least amount of social mobility. And all of those things are happening coincidentally. And our public education system here is, broken as it is in most urban settings. So those larger kind of goals, they can't be realized without that. So in terms of what corporations can do, to answer your question specifically, I think there has to be a more common, honest acknowledgement of the weakness, particularly now in the COVID environment, of the municipalities to be able to provide for the least of themselves, because we just don't have that structure right now, particularly now when municipalities are going to be so in debt after having gone through this COVID crisis. So here is where I think, the organization of a set of priorities that are organized, for example, around a civic structure. I mean, that's something that's open to dialogue so that we could agree upon it. But having those kind of joint manifestos, joint alliances and allegiances which when a city is then courting an additional company to come here, like Google, for example, like Microsoft, like BlackRock, like NCR, etc., then the existent members of the civic order here have a set of priorities into which those new companies have to plug themselves in, rather than just find whatever altruistic missions they want to engage in on their own. We have a set of priorities that are aligned around our own civic ideology.
You mentioned, Ranjan, you mentioned as well, Pamela, I think you touched upon this, the idea of when engaging in this work of being authentic. And I think that is extremely important. It's become more important to folks. As Black Lives Matter, marches were happening across the country, folks were demanding authentic responses from corporations. You might recall that, Ben and Jerry's response was one that was lifted up because it wasn't just a statement, it was an authentic verbalization, writing of what they do. And there was conversation about if you were to line up different companies' responses to how they're responding, they all could look the same. What is the ways in which companies in 2020 showed that they are authentic?
John, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thanks. I think one way is demonstrating vulnerability and not claiming to have all the answers to these questions. And I think when I just look back at how this has unfolded over the last several months at Delta, just our own CEO saying we have a lot, and he has a lot of learning to do, set a tone for a safe space to engage in these conversations, right? And if you had asked me that in 10 years ago, whether the mayor of Atlanta would be at Delta to talk about race and equity in our society, or that Brian Stevenson would visit to talk about his work in the South, or that Bernice King would be there to talk about the legacy of her dad and what Black Americans are going through, it would have been really hard to envision that. But I think by engaging in these conversations in, again, very real ways, and in none of us claiming to have all the answers, it's unlocked a sort of journey of discovery. And I'll just give you an example. I mean, on my team calls now, I have for the last several months tried to share different things I've learned about American history that I did not know and that were not taught to me in my American school. And it's just things like that that start getting you down a path that is authentic. I wore my Delta Airlines Black Lives Matter pin today because this is an idea that came from a flight attendant at Delta who said, listen, we've been talking about Black Lives Matter for years. When can and why can't we also take a stance on that as a company and allow our folks to engage in that dialogue? And it was absolutely the right thing. Did we have all the right answers to it? No, but I think that's the real exciting part about where we're heading right now as a society. And I certainly don't want to claim that we've made any, huge advancement yet. But the fact that we're open to vulnerable dialogue is a really important starting point.
I think Ranjan sets it up perfectly. The authenticity comes from your complete understanding of where you are in the journey, of empathizing with another individual, particularly a set of people, a community. But I also think it also comes from really understanding the values that the corporation represents. Because if you ever want a barometer check on your level of authenticity, ask the consumer and the shopper who buys the product. So someone can, just like with individuals, corporations sometimes get a little bit ahead of where their values are or what they're representing. And shoppers and consumers will always check you back with where you are. And so what I found is really taking a litmus test of identifying what your true identity is to the consumer. And if your current identity is so different from your envisioned identity, doing the massive work to close that gap. And at that point, you then go into all of the social policies, all of the internal policies, all of the talent advancement based on who you are, what your identity is. But I think it does start with a true understanding of your values, this empathy, sympathy, awareness of where you are in your journey, and then just this gut check, obvious gut check with the consumer, who will, with all intents and purposes, tell you the truth at all times. And that's how corporations can stay right in their lane. And when they want to go outside their lane, understanding the journey to get there.
I wanted to thank you for that, Pam. And I also wanted to mention to the audience that our hope is to do some Q&A at the end. So if there's some questions throughout that get spurred on by the conversation, feel free to use the Q&A chat function. But it sounds like when it comes to all these different intersecting major moments that have happened in 2020, which have been, as a year, which isn't even over yet, has been insane, that the need for companies to just lay bare their authenticity in terms of what their plans are. Because I think that is something that people are wanting to know more about, is when it comes to doing some of this hard work, what does it mean? And I think we chatted about, making sure that there's deeper conversation around safe spaces, that we're looking at pay equity. That's become something important. And of course, again, having this CEO roundtable champion, that's very, very important. And it goes to my other question about, what companies must do now and in the future to meet this moment. And we've chatted about, authenticity, and I think which lends itself to transparency, right? But what does that look like? What is that level of transparency that companies should be putting forth, so we can say, hey, we appreciate these statements. We appreciate that your willingness to look at LGBTQ issues. But what's the level of transparency, and how would the public or consumers, to your point, Pam, measure that?
So one starting point is the leadership team reflecting the team members and reflecting the consumers we serve, right? And I think if we think about our journey of the last few years, it was one, getting comfortable with the data of where did we stand, and having a understanding of where we were falling short. And as you got comfortable with the data, we then moved into the stage, which I think we are in now, to say, okay, how do we actually set some vision for what we need to do to create more access for leadership opportunities, so that people can see themselves in the organization at all levels, right? And I think we've been more transparent now about that, and companies across the country are doing this. And I think it was part of a necessary process of first internalizing the fact that we weren't obviously creating as much opportunity as we needed to. So I think that's step one, because for that vulnerability to continue, for that conversation to continue, people need to feel like they've got the ability to rise in the organization. And then I think, as Pam mentioned, are companies taking part in the conversation, and are they doing so at the community level as well, and to see continued action in that regard, right? So hate crimes legislation, there were some states that still did not have it on the books, Georgia being one of them, right? And a whole coalition of leaders in the business community helped make that happen. How do you continue to have that type of action that backs up the rhetoric and the discourse?
I think there's also, in terms of measurement, I agree with Ranjan 100%. I think relative to the measurement of transparency, however, I think the other side is relevant in the constraints against it. I think that the premise of this conversation appears to me so far that we're all kind of in agreement. It seems like we have a similar ideology about being open and being honest and being inclined towards justice and fairness. But that's not universally true. And I think that there is, within these corporations, as is the case in the country, we have countermeasures which don't feel that way. and feel that other people, Black and brown people, Black women in particular, are kind of anathema to what they envision the country to be, especially at this moment. So I think part of the vulnerability is also being offensive. I think that we, and I don't mean in offensive in sense of disrespect, I mean offensive in the sense of not being defensive. And there, I think we do have a moment where some flags have to be put in the ground, where we can't pretend that there's an equivalence in these particular ideologies, that one is just left and the other one is right. At some level, that's true. But there are other levels where that isn't true. And I think that we are inclined to want to be politically neutral for a whole host of reasonable and well-articulated reasons. But we're entering into an era, I think, where that partiality or that impartiality is dangerous. And I think that some of what Pamela was alluding to before about your consumers or your students or the people that you engage with will check you on that your impartiality or your claims of a particular virtue don't ring true. So I think part of the metrics of it is the extent to which we feel compelled to put a flag in the ground, kind of come what may. And I'm not clear yet that we're quite there, but I think it's all part of the evolution.
And so then what's at stake for companies who are not doing that? Because I think that becomes part of the conversation for folks who are in leadership positions, who are in companies who are making these statements, but not putting a stake in the ground, not being willing to look at the data. What's at stake?
Well, I think the entire business strategy is probably at stake, starting with your ability to attract and retain top talent. Because I think talent is ultimately how we all innovate. And clearly the talent in the marketplace today is demanding this type of thinking and this type of discussion. That's one. I think two, we're seeing customers reach out and feel empowered, right? I think the beauty of the internet is, unfortunately, it took us how many murders until George Floyd before we started to see things, but the internet has empowered the consumer in a way that is truly unbelievable. And it allows customers and companies rather to see breakages in their own customer experience and their own products in ways that we didn't before, right? Before, you'd wait weeks to get the letter in the mail. Someone would read the letter, it would go down to 4 different people in the organization. By the time you got back, who knows, a month might have passed. Now things are happening instantaneously. So I think if companies don't, and again, I don't think people are demanding perfection. I think they just want to make sure you're paying attention and taking action as you learn, as you go. And you either, when these things happen and they're pointed out to you, you either rise to the occasion or much to your detriment, you are absent from the solution.
That's right. I think Ranjan hit it on the nose. I think too, they compromise relevance, and just in general, in every capacity. So he talked about talent, consumer, on every angle, you compromise relevance. But I also think there has to be a decision from the leadership of each company on where do these matters actually rest. I truly don't believe human rights should be politicized. I think somehow the country where the state of, just imagine if this had been a discussion even 5-6 years ago. It's unheard of that we are debating the human rights of individuals, and that's called politics some kind of way. And depending on how much you are for a more inclusive environment, you lean left, and how you're more exclusion. I just can't believe we're in this discussion. It feels like we've gone backwards. So back to the future. And I think all of that plays out with the decisions that the business leaders have on the integrity of their business strategy, and that being at risk with some of the decisions. And that's why it's so important that they get engaged in this dialogue, because they have to remind, and like Delta has done, like Coca-Cola has done, like Google has done, that this piece on human rights is not actually politics. That's not politics. And once we depoliticize it and really truly deal with it at its base of inclusion and more reach and more talent and more extraction of innovation and more curiosity, then business leaders can make the right decision and get involved in the dialogue. I think because people are trying to choose sides, it's to watch it on the outside at this vantage point, it's concerning and all consuming.
Let me respond to that. I think first I agree, and I think that the politicization of things is concerning, as you put it. I think that there's also there's some historical precedent here, Ryan, related back to the question that you've asked, and if I don't think it's overly dramatic, but if we think about the period of Reconstruction, from the late 1860s through the early 1880s or so, then it was met with the onset of Jim Crow and the backlash to a decided, intentional, national affirmation of justice, fairness, citizenship, diversity, inclusion for the late 19th century and what manifested itself then. And I think now, if we think about it, let's say from 1964, the Civil Rights Act, till arguably the turn of the 21st century, that to me was a second Reconstruction, where there was a ton of programs and things focused on inclusion and parity. The National Society of Black Engineers, all of these organizations did what they did. There were lawsuits, and the country was focused on trying to get itself together. And I would argue culminating in Obama, there we were. And then here we are again. So now I would argue that this is a second backlash. I think that the signals about the voting and the numbers of people voting give me hope. But I don't think that we should kid ourselves about what this other ideology is and how virulent it is and how vicious it can be, and the language and the words that are associated with it, and the counter ideology, which is why I agree with Pam that this has been politicized. We're politicizing human lives because it's sitting on top of this ideology that I don't think has ever gone away. And relative to the companies that we're talking about, notwithstanding the tech companies, which are only, the big tech companies are just 20 years old. But a lot of these other companies are a century old. So they themselves have the institutional memory of having gone back prior to this second Reconstruction that I'm alluding to. And so they have people, individual people, an institutional memory that recalls what it's like to be specifically anti-Black, specifically anti-woman. I mean, those people and their direct descendants in positions are still there. And I'm not accusing people, but what I am suggesting is that I think that this process has to be put in context. And I think in terms of putting a flag in the ground, I'm with vice presidential colleagues here, so I'm a little out of my league, but I think that putting a flag in the ground here requires recognizing the significance of the moment that we're in. This is not the same thing as just, as you're pointing out, one party versus the other. This is kind of human rights versus an alternative, and that alternative is dark, ugly, and insidious.
This notion of coming to terms with your own history, I think, is such a powerful one, Kamau. And, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's recent passing, I got educated about how she helped women in the airline industry. Okay, so flight attendants in the airline industry, if you were a woman, you had to share a room on a layover. You were denied the highest level of flight attendant position, the purser, which was reserved for men. And there were weight and other, aesthetic considerations to your employment, and that the industry largely embraced. So just think about that for a moment, right? And I do think that's an example of so many for a company that's 95 years old as Delta is, to be able to understand that, talk about it, and also realize what we've done to rectify it, right? Has to happen. And that's part of this sort of, I think, renaissance in general right now of really getting closer to our history at all levels that is happening. And how do you keep pushing that? And whether you do that, of course, starting with our schools so that folks are curious about their history. And then also as adults, how we continue that journey of introspection.
The curiosity about one's history is extremely important. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's something that's going to hopefully allow leaders who are trying to meet this moment understand more thoroughly what has happened in the past, come out to your point, to understand how to affect the future. And I think that, I guess one of the questions that I think some people have on the opposite side of this is, are we asking corporations for too much? Are we asking them to, the corporate, roundtable, they thought that, they needed to have a deeper, more, more thoughtful response for community, not just, shareholders. So that is some folks on the opposite side are saying, we're asking too much. It's like when people say in regards to schools that, you're asking schools to do too much. They're there to teach, and you want them to be counselors and social work. And, you want them to do more than they're supposed to be. What is your thoughts on that, especially as the country is in this moment?
I mean, I think first, your own community within your company is demanding this, right? So I think we need to stop thinking about it just externally and what consumers think. It's our own people want to have these discussions and need to have them, and our own people want to see a more just and equitable workplace and that kind of community. So within Delta, within Coke, within Google. I think because of that reality that is unmistakable, you can't say that corporations only need to do so much, because it's got to start with what you're doing with your own folks first. And that ultimately will have implications on what you do in the marketplace and in your broader community. But I think, going back to that other question you posed, which was companies that aren't paying attention to this or denying it, the problem they face is they have a group of people that they're making a huge assumption around, that those people don't want to have these conversations or don't care or think the same way that the leaders of that company do. And I don't think there's any organization on earth where you can say there's a monolithic way of thinking. I mean, it's just not true, right? And we're only just finally discovering that.
I would argue that the question of the boundaries of corporate responsibility, particularly of companies of a certain size, now is an open question. I would frame it, Ryan, I got this language from you, actually. If we're thinking about what a functioning democratic republic looks like, what are the major institutional pillars that support that? So one, obviously, is the government. The centerpiece, the unit of analysis of democracy, is the individual citizen. But now we have these companies that are, they provide occupations for people, of course, and ways for people to live and be meaningful and viable and make contributions. But they're also, right now, like the most robust fiscal entities in the country. Google is $1 trillion operation with 250,000 people. It's a nation state. As is the case with some of these others, we can go down the list of countries that don't have GDPs that are the same as the value proposition of these individual companies. So our role in having a particular ideology about what the democratic republic is, I think is different. I think in times past, the assumption, whatever you might think about the government, but the assumption that the government kind of handles civic order and takes care of the market failures is something that we could, by and large, assume was true. But right now, apart from the fiscal challenges that the government faces, its polarity has crippled it in ways that make it causes suffering that's clear. And so therefore, I think, within reason, there's a body of discussion now about what those boundaries ought to be. Certainly for companies that have the fiscal robustness to be engaged beyond just surviving and making themselves viable. I think it's an open question. And I think even in Atlanta, particularly relative to Delta and Coke, I mean, Atlanta is defined in many ways by Delta and Coke. In some cases, people might know the CEOs of those companies before they know the name of the mayor. So it's a really open question. I think what those boundaries ought to be.
Other thoughts on, appreciate that, Kamal, and other thoughts on this particular question?
Yeah, I'll chime in on this one. I think both of my friends here, I think they articulated it well. I think the reality is that those communities that are most affected and most marginalized are looking for a voice that represents them. They're looking for a face that resembles them. And good, bad, and indifferent without judgment, that may not be found in some of the institutions that were just noted being a part of the solution. And in the absence of that, corporations, the role of the identity, the responsibility and accountability has shifted to them in order to fill that vacuum. That is the reality. That's the pragmatic reality. The should, on whether or not to what degree, that's obviously an open question, and it's relative, and it's such perception and perspective. But the reason why it exists is that pragmatic kind of stream that I just shared. And so I'll answer your question directly. The should in it. So should a company have such responsibility? Should corporations like the size of Delta and Google and Facebook and Coca-Cola, should we have this responsibility? I would argue absolutely yes, because we are macro microcosms of an entire society. So everything that you see in the environment that's going on, people with different viewpoints, people on this side, people on that side, what's the tension point, what's the way to extract innovation, what's the way, all of these things happen in this macro microcosm called a corporation. And because we get to live that constructive and sometimes, quite frankly, destructive tension on a daily basis, our voices are relevant in the discussion because we've had to navigate it internally. And so in the absence of that voice, there may be a deeper void than the one I just described on the lack of institutions having a leadership voice. And for that reason, corporations matter.
Appreciate that. And it's interesting to think of corporations, as you mentioned, as microcosms of society and the way that they're structured. And so, corporations are, by definition, very much top down. Do you think that corporations are learning, to play on this example, anything from more grassroots organizations doing this social justice work? Do you think that corporations are learning how to take some of those tactics and apply them internally?
There's no doubt about it. I mean, if you think about it, the corporations that we're talking about, we've actually requested, we've what I would say, partnered and had coalitions with people who are closer to the communities that we serve, so that we don't get it right. I think Ron John's note on Ed's statement that he's still learning is something that resembles what our own CEOs have said and what we ourselves have said. And because we don't have all the answers, many of these big corporations have foundations and community partners and public affairs that connect back to the communities to teach us, to educate us on where is the disparity, where is the disparaging policy that we didn't know was a disparaging policy. So I think the relevance of grassroots organizations and their significance also rise in all of this, because they sometimes will be a source of education and teaching for these bigger corporations. And quite frankly, they may also be the beneficiary of a lot of the work that comes out of the work and advancement and journey of these big corporations. So it's twofold from my standpoint.
And there's also grassroots at each of our companies, right? Within those communities, within those microcosms. As we were chatting about before we went live, I went through a 4-hour training today on diversity, equity, and inclusion for an allyship program. that one of our flight attendants said we needed to go do. So think about this. We've been having these discussions on DE&I for some time. And in one of the forums that we've had to create safe spaces to have these conversations and have solutions around this, the idea was, well, why can't all of us be better trained on these topics? And why can't we voluntarily decide once we're trained to wear a pin to signify that we're open to having these conversations? That's pretty profound, and it's really grassroots. And I don't think a team of executives would have come up with that concept, because it's by the people and it's for our people, right? And what's so neat now, having gone through this myself, I'm one of 180 people now who have signed up to volunteer to do this, is you just realize, okay, we are all in this together. We are all learning. None of us have an edge over the other, because it's such a vast amount of knowledge that you have to try to gain and be open to and be curious about. So the grassroots nature of what's happening is if companies are listening to their people and providing safe spaces for that, the ideation is going to be incredible. It will be the same type of ideation we have on product design and that kind of innovation for the consumer we're going to have within our communities itself. And that's just one of dozens of examples that I'm sure all three of us could speak to in our own companies.
I think it's well. I think that's well said. The other just kind of detailed point there is, Ranjan, actually what you were talking about before, where the access to information is instantaneous now. So particularly in service, I mean, it's true of anything that's really providing a service. If there's a problem, everybody knows about it immediately, and I think that has catalyzed grassroots organizations, grassroots information sharing, and points of view in ways that make them far more viable and more integrated into society broadly, but certainly into corporations.
I think the other fine point to it is, and I think you caught the nuance as well, Ranjan, is the best thing that a corporation or a company of any size can do is not make this work separate from the business that it does. This is the business. This is the business strategy. People strategy and business, the diversity, inclusion, equity does not sit outside the business strategy. It is a catalyst and enabler of the strategy. And I think companies that do this work best are those who recognize that out front and incorporate it. So if you're having a strategic planning session with all of the top leaders of the globe or all of the top leaders of a country or of your region, and you're not talking about talent, diversity, inclusion, reaching consumers, there's going to be a disconnect. And I think the more in our leadership voice and style that you integrate the two and understand that diversity is the business case, I think there's a lot more advancement that can be made.
If I can, real quick before you, sorry to interrupt. I wanted to follow up on that from the academy side. I think that one of the things that I'm struggling with that is that while I agree with that basic premise about the integration of the business case and the diversity argument, at Georgia Tech, for example, as I said in the beginning, I'm kind of straddling two worlds. So I'm on the faculty at Tech, and we have, in this last applicant class, there were only 152 Black students in the entire state of Georgia who applied to the College of Computing at Georgia Tech. Out of 40,000 Black seniors in the state, roughly about 500,000 students who are in high school across the state. So while Georgia Tech itself as an institution, we have extolled the values of inclusion and also trying to understand what our role is as a public serving institution, more than just serving the elite students across the country. The reality is that our success theoretically is dependent on having a representational student body and a representational faculty, etc. But it isn't true relative specifically to race in the ways that we talk about in public. And then if I would extrapolate that into the tech sector, for example, Google is, Black women are only 1.2 or 3% of the tech Googlers. But as I said earlier, Google is still approaching being $1 trillion company. So having Black women in tech roles is not necessary for success in the business case. So we could argue that products would be more robust with a more representative workforce, which is absolutely true. But the people who are making these things are brilliant, so they can fix them once broken. Once they get the information that says, well, if I search for Black woman and I get a monkey, that's bad, then I'll fix it. But the reality is that while I agree in theory that those two things are connected, the success of companies that don't have the racial diversity that they espouse as values runs counter to that argument. And I think if we were to envision ourselves as people who don't, as we all do, agree with this basic premise, that argument is pretty strong. And then if they have to step out and be discomforted in some way to address issues of how to navigate with a Black woman that I don't understand, if I'm a white man and I live somewhere where I don't deal with Black people at all, and now I got to deal with you and I just don't get it, then I'm successful. So you're forcing me to be uncomfortable in ways that don't really engender my success. And I think for me, the struggle is what to do with that.
Yeah.
How do we address that argument?
But Camille, I wonder too, where we probably need some more research on if all of us really brought our full authentic selves to work and felt appreciated, our individual contributions to our teams would be that much more.
Productivity.
And even if you are that manager who might not have been exposed, or that leader exposed to the diversity in your team, but they feel that much more a part of bringing themselves to work, they're going to perform that much better for the entity, right? And we've got to find better data points to demonstrate that. But if you think about the go-to people you have in your teams today, and you could amplify that number 5-fold by virtue of being more inclusive, that's incredible productivity and incredible innovation, right? But somehow we haven't yet bridged that to help leaders understand the power of that, of really harnessing their teams.
Agreed.
So I want to transition just a little bit to the idea of the folks in power who can create some of these changes, these systemic changes. And let's say you're in a company that the CEO really gets it and things are moving forward. It goes to the heart of the question that our forum has, which is, how do you create system change that lasts beyond leadership change? How does one do that?
Well, I think you first need a leader to get you started. I think it's hard if the entire top leadership is not willing to hear about needed change. But I think once that leader starts to create that safe space, I don't think it's something you can put back into the bottle. I think it just starts to grow because people feel more empowered than they ever did before, and they feel like they're going to say what's on their minds, and you're going to have to deal with that. So I think systemic change is dependent on leadership. And of course, it's also dependent on incredibly brave people who, in spite of the lack of power, manage the courage to say, I think this is wrong. I think we got to change, and bless them. And they inspire me every day. But I think it does take leadership to start this ball rolling, so it rolls fast and the momentum starts to build. And then I don't think you can really, I think it's just part of how things operate from that point on. But initial thought.
Well, I think there also needs to be, and you have to forgive my little long pauses. I can only see one person at a time. So I think that there's also, there's coalition building here. I think, the idea of what a union is, in its old days, to protect the worker against aggressive forces. Here, unionized influential leadership to protect the civic order and kind of the sanctity of human value is something that can be intentional and aggressive. We can have, as you point out, individual leaders have to be there to begin, coupled with people who are courageous, irrespective of whether the leaders or not. But I think having these kind of coalitions that are really intentional, I'm assuming that the business leadership business roundtable that you're talking about are those kinds of platforms that can help engender and enact that kind of systemic approach. But then coming back, way back to the beginning, it does require an element of vulnerability and honesty for anything systemic to happen, because the system upon which it's built has to be clear, and we have to agree on what that system is, and then we can take steps from there. But I think in Atlanta we have ample opportunity to do that. I think here, of all places, I think we have all the right people in place.
Yeah, and I would just add to all of that is the progress of the infrastructure. So I talked about it a little bit. Policies have to change so that it doesn't matter if Pamela or Kim comes into power, because the policies are set forth so that there's more fairness, or to keep honest people honest, put a different way. So I think looking at the infrastructure of policies, programs, initiatives, strategies that support the idea of inclusion, far more even than diversity, inclusion and equity, is the way to make sure it's a lot more systemic. And largely in part because then that's a handoff, that transfer of power. It's very hard to unravel that. It's intentional to unravel it, and it's a lot more visible to unravel all of that. I think that's why the work has to be done on the infrastructure as well, to support all the other things that were said already.
To speak to infrastructure, one of the things that corporations have are business resource groups, and it comes to us from our first question from the audience, and it's really about, do you consider beneficial for corporations to intentionally have a task force that can work with government entities to tackle these issues in a local and global scope? Do you think that's important?
Is the question referring to the device of the task force itself, or just a way to involve and be connected to local and global?
Well, I think the idea is that business resource groups are often used, and are they beneficial to corporations if they're intentionally working specifically with government entities at the local or global level?
Yeah, I think it's tricky, right? I think the three of us have said, and actually the four of us have said, the importance of grassroots efforts being a part of the solution. So in that spirit, absolutely. I would just have to understand how close to the government does that work entail, because there's definitely, particularly in businesses, this separation between the work done on a political landscape or a government landscape versus that associated with the business. So it's hard to say. Here's why. So I'll turn the question on its head and say, how can the business resource group be effective in moving the government? And the way to do that best is just what we began to describe around infrastructure. Look at the policies that speak to human rights in its purity. So if you think about it, between March and now, a coalition of leaders, I know for a fact Delta and Coca-Cola, I want to assume Google was also integrated in that, and members of the academic community as well, led to the movement of the hate crimes bill being passed alongside the civic members who've always been on the ground making those things happen. So that is a shift in movement. That is a way to start to mobilize a business resource group and say, this is what needs to happen. We ourselves as Coca-Cola, we just made Election Day a company holiday. That happened from grassroots, the employee base saying, leave us you can't tell us for whom to vote, but give us every platform to let our voice be heard. And so now it is a company holiday. So there will be no excuse as to why you're not voting in the thousands here as a company. Those are simple but very meaningful measures and ways that employees resource groups can engage to change the infrastructure, the policies, the outcomes, how business leaders are thinking. And if you can amass a bigger voice, because employee resource group, they tend to be a density of a community of people, if you can amass a bigger voice and engage your executive sponsor, and in tandem with that executive sponsor, move something on the table and the placemat of a leader to assess, you can get more movement in government. You can get, particularly if it's on the side of that corporation's values. If the values of that corporation includes inclusion, you can hold them to task on, these are the things. If the value of that corporation also includes being fairness and voting, you can hold them to task. And so that's how you can be effective. It's only I can answer the question in a way that's a little bit more tangible.
So last question, you're all leaders. What is your purpose as a leader?
I'll go last. I call it.
You know, I think, well, one, leadership is like the hardest thing. Every day I feel like you go back home and you realize the 5 things you didn't do right, or sometimes it's longer than that. It's a humbling journey, and I don't think it's one you ever master. I think it's one that you keep learning from. In my learning so far, it seems as though supporting your team is perhaps the most important task you have. How do you help them pursue their interests and ultimately deploy their talents to incredible outcomes? And I think if you start with a team-centric and people-centric view of it, the business sort of falls quite naturally because people are so creative and they know what the right things to do are. You've got to just make sure they feel supported. So that's sort of my opening salvo on it.
So we're gonna have to circle back after Pam lays down the truth.
Exactly.
I think my philosophy on it has more to do with my purpose as a person, which I'm trying to evolve into. So I think my commitments to these things that we have been talking about relative to just kind of human dignity and fairness, it so happens that the way that that manifests itself for me has to do with technical education here and abroad. But ultimately, I think the purpose of making a contribution, a meaningful contribution of, you know, aspiring to what it means to be a person of integrity, to be a person of dignity, and basically to kind of invoke the principles that we're talking about for others in myself is its own journey. You know, none of us are infallible. And so for me, I think the characteristics of leadership derive from that. I think the extent to which my word means something, that my behavior means anything, that my thought processes mean something to someone else is contingent on that currency. I think ultimately, you know, it's whether or not people will trust you, and that trust is bought through the process of integrity.
I think both of you summed it up very well. I think for me, leadership is kind of a reflection of those values. So psychological safety, clarity, calm, transparency, and the ability to extract the best out of people. And I think if you do that, and I think in its simplest format, if I were to even numb that down to its clearest, I think true leadership is this shift from me focus to we focus, and being able to really put that into practice in all of the different values that one might have to make someone better, which in turn makes the community better, and which in turn makes this macro microcosm better.
So good, so good.
Yeah, empowerment, right, Pam? It's really, if you maybe try to get it down to one word, empowerment is a theme that we've all sort of talked about here.
Sure. I just want to thank you all, Kamal, Ranjan, Pamela, for taking some time with us today. It's been really insightful. And I want to just remind everyone that our next session will be on November 3rd. What's at stake in the election for business and social equity? That'll be Tuesday, November 3rd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register at LGBTQ businessforum.org. Make sure to vote. Thanks again to Delta Airlines for serving as our founding sponsor of this series. And I do hope that you all do make some time to vote, and appreciate your time today. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Everyone. Thanks for having us.
Indeed. It's a pleasure.